no chance and nothing happened. The whole thing was more or less Mickey Mouse, but it was not really Mickey Mouse. It was a preparation for a possibility where people could resist. Now the tragedy was that, and he saved my life on several occasions, and we saved each other's lives, so to speak, whenever we had a chance, because of the cooperation was very close in it, and because of the cooperation. So when all the various people who had a certain number tattooed, which was about 2 digits smaller than mine, I have 168 and they had 140 and something. So these people are rounded up, young people, healthy people, for reasons which still are not clear. In spite of my research, it's not clear. I've not been able to ascertain why they were just taken and sent to the gas chamber. And what they did is just show their numbers through the B camp, B2 camp, where we were. It was a so-called family camp. They took all these people who were actually one of the first to actually start this family camp, B2 camp, Auschwitz B2 camp. And they rounded them up and sent them to the gas chamber. And Freddy Hirsch and many of the other people who were members of this sort of so-called resistance group were taken to the gas chamber. His only resistance at that particular time which he could do was suicide, and he committed suicide. He poisoned himself instead of letting himself be gassed. So that was his last act of resistance. It was an act of resistance. And suicide was an act. I don't let you to kill me, I'll kill myself. I kill myself rather than let you kill me. And many people did that, whatever. And there was individual difference also, how the way people chose to resist. So even if there was nothing else but the drive of self-preservation to live on and keep on struggling to prevail and to survive, that in itself was a resistance. And only those people who stopped resisting who became muscle men, as you remember from your readings and from the discussions. They were the only ones who stopped resisting because they're in no mental and physical condition to resist. So the types, the forms of resistance were manifold, and by no means just the overt ones, the covert ones, which were exceedingly meaningful, escaped, helped each other to escape whenever possible, and so forth and so on. So it'd be a totally wrong concept that only those people who actually fought with weapons or physically were the only ones who resisted. They resisted because they found a crack in the wall. And if there was no crack in the wall, it was very difficult to resist because indeed the very moment you did something, you were dead. And not just dead, shot. Where people were beaten so that they're half dead, cruelly mistreated. And that is precisely what people death was not so much feared as being injured without being able to get into a position where one could get medical attention, and so that was precisely suffering in which inmates tried to avoid, and therefore anything which was hopeless and did not seem to promise any results tended to be avoided, unless you could see a crack in the wall which gave you some degree of hope, some degree of motivation to turn something which was covert into overt struggle.
Rounding out what John has just said, I think I may have mentioned this before, for those who are really interested in following up on what he's just said, 3 books. Laurie Shelley's Secretary of Death, a first-person account. The Doctor in the Dam, Dr. Haas, Jewish camp physician, first-person account. And one one of the art books, Blattner's book or Mary Constanta had up on there. You read those 3 books, and you'll have a real good in-depth picture.
And if you want to have a picture, in the pictures you also can look at Alfred Kantor's,
Yeah,
the book of Alfred Kantor.
Right.
Alfred Kantor was a very close, is still a close friend of mine from way back from Prague. And we were reunited in New York when I came and all this and that. And I was actually the one who told him, he wanted to give me all his pictures and said, I don't have any use for them. Do you want them? I said, no, you keep them because it should be published. And he actually did it. Later on, many years after our discussion about the pictures. So that is something which is exceedingly interesting because it will give you a little bit some idea as to the circumstances and the tangible environment. Yeah, thanks very much. That's very useful.
I guess I've never really got a conclusion on this, but I guess if I, thinking on it now, isn't there a certain amount of blame or curiosity or something, about the Allies or the government, and the fact that it's pointed out in the Escape from Sophie-Bohr book and various other sources that they did know what was going on, and they didn't do anything. For some reason, I find that just like really terrible. I mean, I don't understand why they did it, unless that there really was a lot of anti-Semitism in our government, and they did it on purpose.
I don't really have an explanation which would be, to my mind, satisfactory, other than that they had other priorities. And also I can say in the slave labor camp in which I found myself in a place called Blackhammer, which was because it was the war effort which they wanted to. And they knew also that, of course, inmates were the slave laborers there. So we were raided every time. Every time it started, a trickle of petrol came up. We were air raided. So that they did. Many of the inmates were killed. Not people who were the Germans who were in
by white sailors who started to lob in mortar shells and rock and rifle fire into the camp. And the siege lasted for about a day or something like that. And then what happened was there was a court-martial of the black sailors and not the white sailors. When the Japanese Americans who joined the armed forces after they got out of the detention camps, or who chose to join, were sent to the most, if I remember my military history, and somebody who's more knowledgeable can help me out, was sent to the worst to try to prove their loyalty to the United States, Salerno and places where the slaughter was just there. I think you underestimate the amount of racism, including anti-Semitism in the United States during the 30s and 40s, so that that when John says this was not a high priority to save Jewish lives or anybody's lives through the concentration camps, it's perfectly understandable. And when you understand the splits within the American Jewish community, and I'm sure the equivalent splits within the British Jewish community at the same time, Jews by and large, and particularly Eastern European Jews, felt themselves and sufferance existing in those countries. They always felt themselves marginal. They never really felt themselves at home there. You can understand the ambivalence coupled with the anti-Semitism. You don't have a lobby, so there is no priority in bombing the camps.
Well, what you say, I have no qualms with. I think you're probably very accurate in saying what you say. Fishing camps, and that is something which needs to be corrected. We may have falsely given you the impression that concentration camps are only for Jews. No. That in Dachau, Buchenwald, Oranienburg, and many other concentration camps, not destruction camps, although all of them were in one way or another destruction camp, there are no Jews, or very few. And they were not touched by the Allies either. So, quite jive. Because simply they did not do anything to respond to the concentration camps as an institution to do something about it. Somehow they kept out of it. So, yeah, well, what Richard is saying, yes, I agree to some extent, but, well, there are many concentration camps which hardly had any Jews in them, particularly towards the end of the war, where they were all segregated. There were very few people studied and injured, but they never touched Dachau, ever, until their liberation, and that was a liberation which was non-violent, because the Nazis, the SS, gave up. They didn't resist. They either escaped or did not defend themselves.
Well, I just want one thing to round out what Dr. Zimmer said. In case you
Seem like you because you're black, or or you don't like you because you're this or that. But making that step to annihilating people, I mean, if you hate your neighbor for whatever reason, or you have some problem, which is stupid in itself, but regardless of that, but just making that next step to just killing people, and not doing anything about it. Or, I guess I'm curious in terms of our State Department.
Clean cut, if you will, destruction camp. We resisted to believe that they destroyed there, although we had been there for weeks and months. Simply denial, an absolute denial of something which was obvious. You could smell it, you could see people disappear and all that. Only when people who were very close to you were sent to the gas chamber, only then we were prepared to accept that. You have no idea how people resisted to believe that destruction of that nature on that level took actually place. Remember that I resisted that when I had already been in Auschwitz-Birkenau for a number of months, actually, 2 or 3 months, when my best friend, and I'm particularly talking about those people who were sent for no apparent reason to the gas chamber, able-bodied, healthy people, relatively healthy, so on and forth. And he was one of them, Fredi Hirsch, another, and at Central Camp, then I had to say, people are not gassed there. And I could see it, I was walking actually, I was deloused, and I could smell the gas and all the things, and yet I just simply was, and many of us, were simply unprepared to accept that as a reality. And that, I think, is a very important psychological momentum, denial. Even if you face to face with a situation, somehow you...
But that's what we're talking about. Why did it get not widely known? Because people were killing blacks. And that was okay. If it fits in your self-interest to do it, you'll do it. You'll just freeze it out. Is that your memories, Graham?
The only one, actually a year or more, were simply rounded in a single incident.
For what period of years were you in camps? You said you were at 6 different ones.
From 42, from August, to be exact, August 10, 1942, to about August, July 45.
What was your experience? What did you do once you were free?
What I did?
Yes.
I just tried to go back and hope that all the entire clan and all the other ones had perished, one way or another. And I'm talking about the extended family. Yes, they also, most of them perished. So what I tried is just I came back and did what I could in order to apply what I had learned, and joined organizations, became exceedingly politically active, and now something which I'd like to tell you, which will, nevertheless, one of the first things I did, I joined the Czechoslovak National Socialist Party, which was not a fascist party, but the National Social Democrats. And the founder, one of the leaders of that party had been President Benesch, Dr. Edward Benesch. And the National Socialists were in the name of the communists, and they emphasized socialism and were very nationalistic, but they are not racist, they are not anti-Semitic. They simply wanted to have a socialism within the Czechoslovak nation, which was still to a large extent capitalist, but was not monopolistic capitalism. So that was a very interesting thing, and that was the most effective party up to a point against the, at that particular beginning, communist died there. And I said, well, went to him and saw him, and so we called each other brother, So I said, do you think it's proper if I leave and not stay here? And you think I'm chickening out? So I discussed it with them, and most of them said, leave. Of course, you can be much more useful outside than inside, and so I took that very seriously.
Within the camps, among the prisoners.
Not camps, I said Dachau.
Okay, at Dachau, among the prisoners. We've talked about anti-Semitic feelings which existed in this country prior to and during the war. Have you felt a continuing threat of anti-Semitism in your wanderings through the world since the camps? And what
There was any sort of obstacle or would have been a problem. In the Midwest, I haven't had a problem there at all. Did not notice it. When I worked as part of the Air Force, I didn't notice it. And obviously, during the summer, and even not during the summer, people see my number, my tattoo. So I mean, it just no. In Australia, it was a different story because the place was full of former fascists, ethnic people who were exceedingly sympathetic to the Nazi cause. So that is something which is very unusual, which I found there. But at this school, for example, here, Sonoma State, I yet have to see anything which is anti-Semitic. Or Berkeley.
do you have any? Now you grew up on the East Coast, didn't you? What do you feel about
Issues that are coming up now for Chinese and Japanese Americans were at that time, I mean, I can still remember the quotas against my high school for specific schools, for specific universities in terms of the quotas. California is a very peculiar place because unless you're black, Chicano, or Indian, or Asian, everybody's white here. And so California is not part of the real kind of prejudice that I found in the rest of the country. Elsewhere about the kind of, I remember too, just to give you a personal example of it, I was in the dorms in college in this town in Michigan, and two guys from Grand Rapids came over to me who were somewhat friendly with me, and they told me that I was one of the good Jews. It was interesting when I had filled out my college application for dorms, they asked you what you wanted for a roommate, and I said, please, whatever you do, don't put me in Hooker. That was my main thing. I hate cigarette smoke. They paired me with the one Jew in the dorm who was from Cleveland and smoked. But it was in 1959.
Did you have to put on your application that you were Jewish?
No, I was from New York. That's enough.
That's all they
See, that's all they see, was that if you're from New York, or certain sections of Chicago, certain sections of Detroit, certain sections of Cleveland, Shaker Heights, Cleveland Heights, they'll know. They just know where you're from, and they know that you're more likely to be a
His
Jew.
name wasn't O'Reilly.
Right, his name was O'Reilly. So to answer your question about the anti-Semitism, I saw it very much as part of my childhood. I remember very much Easter times when the priests used to get the kids in the local Catholic school all hot up to go and kick ass with the Jews and the things because we killed Christ. And the Catholic Church used to boycott all the interfaith days. And everybody else that was Catholic, there was a complete separation. Has that changed much? It's complicated, to answer your question. It's subtle. There's subtle kinds of anti-Semitism in the United States. If you'll notice, for example, the recent scandals on Wall Street have all been by those firms which led papers. Bear Stearns was one of the major brokerage houses. A whole bunch of them that have led in Jews. Other firms will not let in Jews, and those have not been touched by the financial scandals in the last 5 years.
But do they say that?
No, but you have to know that. You look through the things and you read the profiles of the people who've been caught, like Levine and Boesky and a whole bunch of other people. You go down the list of the people and these patterns start to emerge. I knew in college in the Midwest he was Japanese American, and he had grown up in the Berkeley area. He came back to the Midwest to spend some time, and then went back to Berkeley to live. And asked him if he felt it any easier, and he said, yeah. And I said, what changed in the few years you'd been from there? He said, the blacks moved in. Well, Japanese and Chinese are more white than black, so everything got a little bit easier. That's California. Everybody's a white person. I think that anti-Semitism is on the increase. This is not my paranoid opinion. This is stuff that's been documented by the ADL and the various other Jewish research groups that keep a lock on what's happening. And I've told some of you this story, but I was driving across country 2 years ago, and we made a point of driving through nowhere. Real issue has been monitoring. Everybody knows what the ADL is, the Anti-Defamation League, and they keep a watch on this stuff. And through the prairie states and the plain states, they are watching all of these kinds of events where what's interesting, what's bizarre about it, what makes some crazy sense, is these are the same groups amongst whom Jackson was getting a lot of support. At the same time, some of the same people were also joining Nazi groups and neo-Nazi type groups in the same thing. It's bizarre. It's a bizarre kind of a thing. But it's the disturbing thing about it.
There's one thing which I like to say, which is kind of a cynical sort of thing I've been told on many occasions, that anti-Semitism will be limited in the United States by virtue of the fact that there are blacks here and so many other ones who will deflect. And if you really look at it a little bit more, actually to publish the names in one of my publications of publishing companies which seem to develop a particular knack for writings of anti-Semitic writings, as well as research which tends to whitewash crimes against National Socialism. One particular publishing company, other ones don't do that and just simply come out with material which is highly controversial and tends to glorify the military achievements and the reasons for Hitler entering into the war. So you've got a number of different sort of messages, but yes, the fact is, and I think there's no question about it.
What I'm concerned with, or other people do, from people who I consider friends, that they've seen too many movies, too many television shows about the Holocaust. They're getting fed up with the Holocaust. And I think that's a reaction to history, which shows that there are kind of limits that people have, or their toleration can be breached about painful episodes of nation. There were scenes where there were German soldiers in cities in France, and the French were saying, I never saw German soldiers in the cities, and everybody knew that they were kind of in downtown. And there was another film entitled Hitler, I Don't Know Who He Is. And it was more or less an investigation of French teenagers who didn't know who Hitler was 15 years after the war.
I'd like to ask Bob one question on this. Had the biggest army
in the early days of the 30s. Right. Had the biggest army ready to go. How have they how has their consciousness been affected? How have they explained this away? That they lost the war when they had this great big army and the experience of World War I.
Then was the French general who essentially fought in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871. And what Bloch was getting at with the expression that Bazaine had won in 1940 was the fact that Bazaine represented traditional French values in the same way that Marshal Pétain did. And that essentially the traditional French ruling class.
It's all very younger students or other students here are not getting a chance to ask much more perhaps simple questions about what we're learning in this seminars. And we're dominating us, you know, you and me, and I want to shut up, so I want other people. Anyways, I'm part of this class too, you know, so I'm speaking up as a student.
Could I ask Dr. Steiner a question?
Of course, you know, absolutely. I'm not trying to control, it's just I don't want to dominate. Because that's all I'm saying. Thank you.
You mentioned that the Archbishop of Prague had been a close personal friend, ultimately became a cardinal. What was his explanation of the fact that the Vatican did not intervene when they had so much knowledge of what was going on?
Yeah, no, because he himself was one of the first to be sent after the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia when he was and the cardinal when he actually left Czechoslovakia was permitted to leave officially and found refuge in Rome where he was and he became cardinal and shortly afterwards actually died and is buried in St. Peter's. He had none, and he was very critical of them too. Very critical and was exactly showing the other side. As so many other ones who were in Dachau because they didn't. They resisted. They resisted. The Catholic anti-Semitism.
So they were consistent as human beings.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And I met quite a few. So you had a number of different types, and he belonged to the other types, were the defenders of what they defined as Christianity according to the teachings.
Shit.
No, you're not. You have a PhD, you can't talk to.
It would be good if
They're not the French.
in
Yeah.
Germany, and I'm not so concerned about the people that write obvious, blatant, glorified Germanic history, as I am concerned about the modern historians who are beginning to be very subtle about the way that they are classifying this genocide as one of many genocides and therefore not too significant. And the one they always compare with, it seems, is Cambodia, since Cambodia is more recent and obviously so terrible that the Holocaust must not be so bad. And I think if anyone else were writing it, besides a German historian, you might not look at it so closely, but it smacks slightly of revisionism, whereas, you know, if it was coming from someone else, has anybody else read any of that material, or are you familiar with any of the modern German historians right now? Ernest.
Yeah, I'm very
Remember
much
the names.
because I've published with some of them. But what you say, I think is very true. On the other hand, you have to understand if you identify, and these people are German nationals and they identify with the society, so they try to find any sort of. They are not the only ones who have committed genocide. Which is true. Except the magnitude of the whole thing and the cultural differences and the conditions are not being stressed here. You see, because it's just comparing apples and oranges. So I think we have to be more careful. But yes, that is a tendency. somehow to say, well, we are not the only ones, there are some other genocides which are going on right now, and what are you doing about it? Just don't concentrate on us,
Right.
but also, and that I think is taking place. I think there is no question about it.
Well, I'd be interested to find out the age group of the people who are writing these things in terms of, I guess I oftentimes look at people like my parents or whatever, who tend to, I mean, they're in their late 60s or whatever, to tend to sort of try and rationalize their lives, what they have done in the past. I mean, this has anything to do with, the Holocaust or whatever, but just, they're sort of doing an overview of their life.
The racism, but only to bring about a united Europe, believe it or not, a united Europe which was would counter the aggression of the communists, the Soviets. And that was our intention. That's what they say in all seriousness. Well, ideologically, and particularly if you do research on it as I have, yes, there were certain remnants, there were certain groups of people within the SS who were given the task to study that and bring that about. And also Himmler was very interested in, were viewed as Germanic in terms of their origin, joined the military SS to fight against the Soviet Union. But what they don't say, that they also are racist. They don't say that. That's not mentioned, that they're racist.
Let me add to what John's saying and also say something about what Carol said. The irony, if you follow that revisionist, to add to what John just said, I don't know if the person who talked about the German diplomacy during the war mentioned this, but there's a book, I can't remember the author of it, I think it's called Secret Surrender, and it's about the policy followed by some people within the OSS at the end of the Second World War, which was that, again, the details escape me, but the gist of it was that the United States sent a representative to Switzerland to arrange for transfers of American, kept yelling back to Roosevelt, said, what the hell's going on? Roosevelt did not know anything about it, but I think you understand that the depth of this German feeling, and that there were people in the United States who shared that same feeling, who became the head of the CIA later on. This is Allen Dulles. His brother was Secretary of State under Eisenhower. He was the Secretary of State under the CIA Director under Kennedy. We're dealing with a group which said the Jews were an incidental factor. The Gypsies were an incidental factor in fighting communism. That was the main enemy.
At that particular point. But by the way, the secret surrender actually took place, and one of the major roles was played by a man called Karl Wolff, who co-signed that surrender and negotiated it with Allen Dulles in Switzerland. Right. And there are several books. One is one of the most authentic, by the way, also actively involved in that. And there are interesting books which have been published on that particular subject. One by a Swiss general who participated in that, another one by Dulles, and another one by another author which escapes me now. So there are three major books on that particular subject. Oh yeah, what was it? I just forget the name, but he's historian, and he's written a book on that with a co-author. But the surrender took place and was signed by one of the SS generals who was formerly Himmler's right-hand man, along with Heydrich.
Actually, this is in Peter Hoffman's book. This concept goes.
Are there groups, South Africa, are the blacks in South Africa vulnerable to a Holocaust? How do we take what we've learned about the past and how do we use it in analyzing what's happening around us today and projecting for tomorrow? Otherwise, what's the point?
It seems to me the next logical step is in the nuclear Holocaust is learning to live with each other. And it's, in a big part, it's my own ignorance. Anti-Semitism was as big as it is in some areas. So I mean, I couldn't tell. The person that I work with, I found out recently he's Jewish. I've talked to him about this class, and I've never held him in any disregard because of his background. And I don't know. I think what's important is that we all learn to live that way. You have to accept people for who they are, not what their roots are and what they come from.
You first. See, that's the dilemma.
You know,
Is
what I'm
this- Who
saying
goes
is-
first?
Maybe because I lived without it. I mean, I don't know that my parents ever were. My mother's been coming to this class as well. She just happens to not be here today. I mean, I didn't ever feel that I had it. And maybe if there's some way that people could begin without knowing what it's all about. It's as though because I had this ignorance that today I just accept people for who they are, not what the color of their skin is or their roots.
You know, there's something that John said about and the quote religious, but it's an ideology. Now, they all have it to some extent, one worse than another, but unless we can examine that which some of us consider as quote sacred and untouchable, that is the beginnings, because there is the discrimination starts, whether again it's Jews or blacks or Chicanos or whatever. But I mean, look at California, and the Indians were not. They were debating for, I don't know, 100 years or so, whether they had a soul. And already it was several, probably 1,000 years after the beginnings of teaching of anti-Judaism. And so this is quite recent, Look at where those things start to happen in our business affairs and our friends, and I'm looking about, I see a lot of anti-Semitism, and it's covert. They don't express it, but in this last paper I wrote for a class of mine was that I talked to ministers, and they were talking to me about the Holocaust and how terrible it was, and all of that, and they seemed wonderful. And I asked them, is there any teaching going on in your church about the Holocaust? Well, no. You see? So that is silence about that event, not just about that event, but any other local events, about Central America, South America, and all those other problems. They're just silent about it. And of course they're silent about the to be questioned.
Another thing that's interesting, I remember from my high school history, there was a sprinkling of the Holocaust of World War II. But I don't remember anything about American Indians. And that's, it's kind of like what you're talking about now going on in Germany. They're ignoring something that's dark and ugly from their history. And I think it's important. I really got turned on to this American Indian business when I was in college because I had a provocative history instruction. And for that, I would have probably gone on the rest of my life believing that the American Indians just they weren't a problem. They just weren't there.
Now let me just ask you a question. Have you never seen cowboy and Indian films? Yeah, which this society is absolutely
And they always
penetrated.
those movies always portrayed the Indian as a bad guy.
Well, but you see, that's what I'm dying and killing them by the masses. The more the better. The society answers whenever I can. The open perspective on life, which means which will be added to whenever new information comes our way, and we'll simply put that in instead of being ideologically brainwashed in a way that this is closed-ended and not an open-ended view on life. And ideologies are closed-ended because they are unchangeable. You just think in terms of changing the notion people have about National Socialism, tell them that something needs to be changed. No way. And any sort of ideology which is militant, which is dogmatic, is not going to change because they say they are right and therefore they will not accept anything which would subject them to any sort of criticism.
Ideology, I think it's more a question of what ideology we have. There's a very good article by Erik Erikson contrasting the ideology of Hitler and Gandhi. And the big point that Erikson makes is that Gandhi had an ideology which he calls inclusive. It took everybody into it, whereas Hitler had an ideology which was exclusive and defined people out. And I think it's true that most ideologies do work in an exclusive manner. But in fact, like Gandhi, and I think we probably need to study him a lot more, who made it a deliberate attempt to include everybody in his ideology.
Except I wouldn't say that he had an ideology.
Pardon me?
I don't think he had an ideology. He had a perspective, a teaching, which I think we need to distinguish what is ideology and what is perspective. And I don't think that Gandhi had an ideology or preached an ideology, because to be an ideologue is a very different sort of thing. So I think we need to distinguish between different types of ideologies. But any ideologies tend to be closed-ended, regardless how benign or relatively undogmatic they may be, but an ideology by its very nature is something which is closed-ended. And I think Gandhi does not fit into being called an ideologue. I think it would be totally contrary to his perspective on life. And that's exactly...
Some of his followers are, though. If you study the nonviolent movement, there are people who are ideologues about that.
Well, but you see, the very moment you become dogmatic about something,
Well,
I think
I just wanted to differentiate between Gandhi
you
and
have
followers.
you have missed the boat, particularly in terms of Gandhi, his notion of nonviolence.
Right.
But once you become an ideologue and dogmatic, you cease to be nonviolent, either in thoughts or in acts.
Or my view,
Yes.
who are the way they are, and offering someone something and say, well, we have this, but if you don't accept it, you're going to go to hell. That's the bottom line answer. That's not love. That is the creation, the very creation, the beginning of problems.
Well,
in the
I
world.
agree with you. I agree with Jeff, but I'm just talking about specifically teaching about the Holocaust itself.
I see
what-
Christianity needs to teach about the Holocaust because it has no redeeming, as far as I'm concerned, unless it does that. I'm not saying that there are not good Christians. There are. But for the most part, as I understand it,
Well, you see, you have to go to the bottom line, namely that Christianity, to a very large extent, particularly dogmatic Christianity, which I agree with you, was not the spiritual brand of Christianity, if we can call it that way, was the first to introduce anti-Semitism, or first, or well, after anti-Semitism under the Romans.
Yeah.
You know, let's face it. I mean, that's something very important for us to realize.
Matthew
That-
25.
That it is not that it is not something which has been but particularly after the event of Christianity, Christians became increasingly, particularly around the year of 1000, became intolerant towards non-Christians in general, and in particular against the Jews, and I think therefore the Christians should be aware of the fact that anti-Semitism to a large extent was perpetuated by Christianity. And therefore I think they have to do something in order to remedy the situation. As those people I've encountered in Dachau, for example, who did all they could in order to remedy what they could on their level, and some did a tremendous job and were very influential, particularly by virtue of the fact that they're role models to many others. And I'm particularly Joseph Barron, who was the Archbishop of Prague. I mean, nothing could have been further on his mind than preach or say anything which was anti-Semitic in the most remote form. He was a human being and behaved according to his understanding of his faith.
another example I need to give you is that for this Yom HaShoah, which was the
people as equals without the prejudice of this is a sinful person, or this is a handicapped person, or whatever criteria
This
we
is an
want
old
to.
person.
Yeah. Well, in that case,
I just have to say this, I have to unfortunately go, but, you know, I really sincerely believe as some kind of a religious thing, it's,
Issue. And so I think that's what we need to go, because anything else tends towards ideology again. Maybe religious or political or social ideology, it becomes again an ideology. Say, I'm a Jew and I'm very important and this. No, it's not important. It's important if I behave like a human being or if I don't behave. And that I think is, and everything else is a private issue. And so I see what you are saying. And I think we should go that way. I think it's not important to me as an individual and to those who share the faith. That's important. But I should not go around and say, hey, I'm Jewish, I'm Christian. What? It creates barriers. Just like you say, I'm German, I'm Czech, I'm this and that. Well, yes, it might be of interest in terms of my ethnic background because there are some associations, relationships, interdependencies which may come into the picture in terms of who I am and how I've been socialized and what sort of. But the other thing should be de-emphasized, and I think we should not, I'm a Jew, who cares? Behave like a human being. That's what is important.
in the best of all possible worlds.
Precisely.
You know, one of the things that I got to realize is talk about anti-Semitism, but I can make it anti-black or anti-Chicano or
Anti-white.
anti-white.
It's laid out.
And you
Easy.
too.
We're sure making up for it.
That is an important, very important. What I don't know, I can't believe. And what I know, I don't need to believe. So therefore, any sort of belief or myth system will be eliminated to a very large extent. Because I either know something, then I don't need to believe it, or I don't know for the sake of believing it. I think that's a very important stance, which I'm trying to share with my students. And the more I can do that, the more tolerant I will be of ambiguity, because life is full of it. And if I develop this sort of tolerance of ambiguity, by the way, that is a term which was coined by Elsa Frankel Brunswick, a Austrian Jewish psychologist, and her husband taught at Stanford, both professors of psychology. And so I worked with her very, very closely while just during her last phase she committed suicide in the second part of the 50s. And she was the one who coined that this particular expression and wrote a paper on that, also reflected in I don't call author of. It's a very important term and has been dreadfully neglected and ignored. And I'm trying to retrieve that because I think it has tremendous consequences if we understand the meaning of it.
I've really enjoyed this small group kind of atmosphere today, and the questions and the give and take. Maybe it's impossible to.
Holocaust Study Center are doing that in addition and above the call of duty. We are not getting a time off. It is something which we do because we think we should be doing that. That includes Professor Brown, myself, Professor Zimmer, and some other people who have participated in that more actively, and there are some who are less active but very supportive. We are not getting a dime. I've just talked to the Vice President today and said what sort of possibilities do we have that we might get some time off. Finance secretary, we have here the executive secretary who does work and types and works on manuscripts for me and for others for nothing, because we don't have any money. And this is something which is not being recognized, and I think you can help us in perhaps spreading the word that we do that because we feel that there is a need for what we are doing. Not only that, but it's our conviction that this needs to be done, both teaching load we have, because we are convinced that something needs to be done along these lines. But we don't get much support, so maybe you can think about it and think of how we can get some support, not just monetarily, but you can also donate some of your time and apply the knowledge which you've been able to develop here and carry it further and spread the word and relate. I think is exceedingly important. And that's why we do what we do, in order to bring about some sort of change. And it starts, grassroots, that's exactly what it is. But in Northern California, we are the only university having a program of that nature. The only ones who are exceedingly well-heed, have a lot of money, is UCLA, where they have a chair, a Holocaust chair, Friedland. And they have but we are a poor university, and we also located in a different area where this sort of endeavor is not necessarily viewed as a priority. So we need to change that. And we only can change that if we get more support. So what you can do is help us to get that support we need so that we can continue in our work.
On children in France during the Holocaust, it's showing in Petaluma this week, for anybody who's interested, Alavala Evan, which means farewell children, if anybody's interested. It's a good film in the world.
The speaker that came here, Odette Myers, she lived through that.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of France, too.
Bob, you were here when
What's that?
the panel, the Odette Myers was